and welcome. My name is Emma Tordsson. I'm a senior enterprise architect with Workday. Workday is a SaaS provider of enterprise applications, and we were once a monolith. We've been on our Kubernetes journey for a couple of years now, which is why I'm super excited to be here today with Tessa, my co-presenter. Sorry. To talk to you about the state of Kubernetes in New Zealand. We will be doing a survey towards the end of our talk. So in the slides, you'll see the instructions on where to go. So please go and participate, because we love people's inputs. Now, the idea of the survey, as was mentioned in our introduction, came about probably about a year ago as Tessa and I were reviewing the big reports coming out around the state of Kubernetes. And we were wondering, well, what's the situation in New Zealand? So we decided to go and create our own survey. So that's what we did. 22 questions was sent out far and wide into the New Zealand IT landscape, and we got 73 responses back. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Kubernetes has been declared mainstream by the other big providers who are doing similar surveys. Is that the same thing in New Zealand? I don't know. We're going to find out today. Here's a little secret, though. Not everyone has heard about containers and Kubernetes. It wasn't that long ago that I went to meet with a customer of mine, and it was the CTO, a few key members from his IT team, and we were sitting there talking about their technology strategy and their hopes and dreams, as you do in these meetings. I asked about their cloud strategy, and specifically around containers and Kubernetes, and I was met with an absolutely blank stare. Turns out that they had not actually heard about this technology. They had a vague sort of recollection that maybe a vendor had mentioned something about containers at one point, but Kubernetes was for them completely unknown. It's easy to forget that not everyone is on this craze of talking about Kubernetes, especially when you're in the midst of a Cloud Native Summit, where I'm sure the organizers had their challenges boiling down the Kubernetes talks to only 2 today, with it in the title, and 1 workshop yesterday. But it is still potentially an emerging technology. It's been around for probably 7-8 years since the first 1.0 release came out. We at Workday have been on our Kubernetes journey for the past 5 years. So that came about. We simply realized that to continue to provide the best level of service to our customers, the way that we could achieve that was by going public cloud. And the things that we would be able to achieve by doing this move is things like zero downtime, adherence to regulatory requirements, compliance, but also to be able to enable our developers with modern technology. Kubernetes has been the path that we have chosen, and that's been a pivotal part of how we've managed to get along on the cloud journey that we are on. It is an ongoing journey, and we've certainly encountered our challenges, and a lot of the challenges that we've faced are challenges that have been also stated in the survey for the New Zealand state of Kubernetes. So with that little teaser of the findings, let's jump into what everyone has said. If there's anyone in the audience today who participated in our survey, thank you. We do so appreciate all of the input and willingness to answer these questions. So the first big question is, well, how big is the uptake of Kubernetes in New Zealand? And from our questions, 55% are actively using Kubernetes in production, which is quite good. We'll get to the comparison with global trends in a second, but one thing that we might have a look at as well that I just want to draw your attention to is the 16% who have stated that they actually don't need container orchestration. That's a relatively high number in the scheme of things. We're not sure why. One of them are actually using containers, but seem to not feel that there's a need for it. If anyone has insights, come and talk to us afterwards, because we'd love to hear your thoughts around this. We can only guesstimate. We're also seeing in New Zealand quite a high number of organizations that are using non-Kubernetes-based orchestration methods for managing their container workloads. So that's another interesting finding. The next thing that I want to draw out of the survey is the benefits. So the benefits that Kiwis have realized that have adopted Kubernetes as a container orchestration platform are these. Now, we mentioned before that the inspiration from the survey came from other global surveys that have been conducted, and that has allowed us to do some comparison points. So how is New Zealand tracking compared to the rest of the world? I'm only going to pull out a couple of key points, if you want to move on, that could be of interest to the audience today. So let's have a look at how New Zealand compares to the rest of the world. One of the things is around the uptake. So we've already talked about how 55% are using it actively in production. If we combine everyone who are using it in production with those who are evaluating it or plan to use it in the near future, that number creeps up. But as you can see, compared to the cloud native survey findings, we are lagging a bit behind. 96% globally are saying that they are either currently using or evaluating Kubernetes, whereas in New Zealand, the number is as low as 61. If we look at it overall from more of a, are we adopting containers as an IT strategy, then that is more of a resounding yes, New Zealand are doing containers, but we do tend to diversify our platforms more so than what we're seeing globally trending. The next part that we can talk about is where do we deploy said containers and Kubernetes platforms. In the global surveys, there's quite a high prevalence of people deploying it strictly on premises in their own data centers, and we're seeing much less of that being done in New Zealand. That could simply be a matter of the resource constraints in Kiwis having to invest in the time, resources, and infrastructure that it takes to back this type of deployment. We are very, very cloud happy in New Zealand. I think we can all agree that that has been the case for quite a while now. One question that we didn't ask that they have asked in other surveys is around the good old philosophical question, going with one cloud or going with multiple clouds. And it really depends on who you ask what the answer to that question is. Do you go with one cloud provider and go really deep with their service offerings, or do you spread it across multiple clouds? For Workday, we have opted for a strictly multi-cloud approach because we want to avoid vendor lock-in. We've got various products that have been built in particular hyperscalers based on their services, and that's the strategy that we will go with. I would like to, if we were to do this survey again, to ask the Kiwis directly whether they're going with a multi-cloud strategy or not. If I interpret the data and the Kubernetes offerings that Kiwis are deploying at the moment, it is looking like 75% of organizations are actually pursuing a multi-cloud strategy, which is significantly higher than the 46% that they're finding globally. So that's something that would be very interesting to explore more, because are Kiwis going multi-cloud? And the last thing is just around the benefits and the challenges that we're seeing, and we're very much tracking along the global trends here. We love Kubernetes, and we love it because of the resource utilization rates that we're getting out of it. The challenges, the number one challenge that they're seeing globally is the exact same challenge that we are seeing in New Zealand as well, and that's simply a lack of local knowledge and local expertise. I think the reason we're seeing the numbers tracking quite high in New Zealand is that even though there is a global talent shortage within the IT area and specifically within cloud native technologies, that talent shortage has just felt a little bit more in New Zealand. We're quite a small country, but we're very ambitious when it comes to our technology, and we don't always have enough people. Technology has been ranked first on the skills shortage list for years, and with the pandemic, and a few of you mentioned that in the survey as well, that certainly hasn't helped, and having the borders closed and us not being able to draw on the overseas talent that we would usually pull in has meant that we are feeling the pain more now than we have before. Those are the big, broad strokes and trends that we're seeing for the global comparison with the state of Kubernetes, but I'm going to hand it over to my cohort here, Tessa, to go deep into the weeds with our findings.
Right, thanks, Emma. So, I guess first of all, we've looked at who's using Kubernetes. The next question is, how are we using it? How are we architecting it? And why are we doing it as well? So, actually, we found that of the people who said they were using Kubernetes, 56% of those people ticked that containerized monoliths were a benefit in and of themselves. And I guess, is that, maybe we could have asked that question a little differently, because that's kind of, there's a lot of ways to slice that. So we did a little bit of analysis to see if we could see, well, what's the real benefit out of containerizing a monolith? And we actually found that of that 56% who containerized monoliths, 72% of those people had improved resource utilization, which is actually higher than the total survey responses as a whole, which was 61%, right? And of the people who had containerized monoliths, 82% had faster software development life cycles. But we did also have a few comments, like for example, someone who'd migrated a legacy application and was questioning the value. So that might give some insight into why not everyone found those benefits, but also it's actually about whether those benefits pay off. So what do you need to think about in order to make the decision of whether it's going to be worth moving a legacy monolith to Kubernetes? And I actually just sort of tripped myself up there, because I think I have been biased in the past of thinking monolithic applications are legacy generally, and they, modernize by going to Kubernetes. But I currently work at Sneak, and I've learned from our engineering team how they've approached decomposing a monolith. And this is a company that has been an absolute rocket ship on a massive growth trajectory. It's only 6 years old, and they've been decomposing a monolith. So it's not a 30-year-old legacy application. It's actually, reasons you might even start with a monolith today. They were talking about when you build a startup, you often still start with a monolith because you don't know how fast it's going to grow or how far it's going to grow, and just getting it out the door and getting the payoff of that early development means that you just keep the architecture simple. And so I think there's a good lesson there of what is the monolith? What's it doing for your organization? Is it actually supporting top line business value, as in, is it bringing in revenue? Or if you're in government, is it accelerating or enhancing the service you're providing to citizens? And can you quantify that enough to show why, 81% of respondents said who moved a monolith to Kubernetes found that they had faster software delivery. And while, in IT, we often think about improved resource utilization as being the goal of changing infrastructure architectures, actually, the value that you can get from that can be significant, but it's also limited. There's only so much you can consolidate, even moving to containers. But if you can accelerate software delivery and keep adding features that enhance value to your customers, that top line value is, potentially unlimited as these architectures with Kubernetes allow you to scale. And so probably like the biggest question to ask is whether that speed enhancement benefit that you might get from moving a monolith to Kubernetes is actually going to, over time, justify the effort that you put into migrating. And the other thing that Sneak did very well, and is a really good example of, and actually still going through some of these processes today, is starting early enough that while still in the growth phase, once you recognize that this application or service is taking off and it's going to need to scale, actually starting that effort before it gets to a point where your customers or your users are noticing the slowdown from the tech debt of maintaining a monolith, And so you can take it piece by piece while still delivering features at speed. And then once you're complete, you actually get this hockey stick of even more accelerated delivery of features. So those are some good lessons from Sneak about migrating from a monolith to a microservices architecture. So a little bit more detail about how people are architecting Kubernetes. This isn't a question in the global surveys, but I just thought it was interesting because I noticed that, I'm working with some customers who are running a very large single Kubernetes cluster using namespaces as their segmentation, and other customers who are quite small who have a separate cluster per environment. And so I wanted to see, as part of this survey, what is the actual trend out there, and what's the impact. So if we go to look at the impact, just looking at those who were running a single cluster first, of those who answered our survey, 100% of the people running a single cluster experienced improved resource utilization, but with the caveat that most of those people weren't running Kubernetes at scale. They were running under 50 workloads. There was only one, I think, running between 50 and 200 workloads in a single cluster. So if you want to get those sorts of benefits out of Kubernetes and you're a smaller organization, definitely worth looking at using things like namespaces to segment. And if we go and look at a cluster per environment, this also kind of backs it up, because there were several organizations who had under 50 workloads who were running a cluster per environment. So that could be a different cluster for dev, for test, for production, or it could be different network segments. If you had under 50 workloads and you were running those multiple clusters per environment, but nobody there experienced improved resource utilization. And then when we started to get into scale, and we did have quite a few customers running over 350 workloads who responded to this, 100% of them, again, got improved resource utilization. So then it kind of raises the question, if you sit in the middle, like if you've got between 50 and 350 workloads, what do you do? And we actually had kind of a split in our data. We had quite a few responses below 50 and a lot of responses over 350, and not that many in the middle. So it was hard to pull out meaningful insights. But if we go on, I think something worth considering is, how is Kubernetes adoption going to grow in your organization? So in our survey, we asked what percentage of new applications will be deployed to Kubernetes in the next year, and the overall average was 71%. And we also compared that with some data that the VMware survey mentioned at the beginning, which is the expected growth globally. So most organizations globally are actually expecting either notable or substantial growth in Kubernetes over the next year. And you can also see the trend of Kubernetes uptake ticking up year over year. This is the first year we've done the survey, but in future we may ask these questions as well. So that also got me interested in, if you're not actually deploying those new workloads, so the other, 29%, where are they going? And actually 44% are still going to virtual machines, but there's quite a lot of uptake of serverless in New Zealand as well. SaaS applications and PaaS platforms a little bit, actually for SaaS, maybe a little bit further behind than I would have expected based on the conversations I've had, but that may have been biased based on who we targeted. We were looking for people with DevOps, DevOps in their title, or principal engineer or platform engineer, or development managers, those sorts of roles. So, while it was an open survey, we were targeting specific groups, and that I think that may have biased the SaaS applications insight. All right. So next on, and maybe we just go through these because I'm running out of time. I do want to address some of the challenges as well. So, as Emma mentioned, lack of experience was number one, but a strong number two was meeting security and compliance. And so let's drill into that a little bit more, because we did ask some more detailed questions about security. And again, the top concern for security was lack of expertise on Kubernetes security. So still that theme, but I thought we could actually address some of that in this talk. So the next concern was securing container images. So I'll share some best practices with you about that. So in a lot of organizations, the general practice, or just, if you're a developer, the sort of default thing to do is often you'll trust, you'll trust NPM, you'll trust Node, because that's big open source ecosystem. So I'm going to start developing in JavaScript from the latest Node image. But actually, if you pull the latest tag for Node, there's quite a lot of high risk vulnerabilities in there, just in that latest tag. And there are open source contributors who've done a lot of work to already remediate some of these. So the first thing you can do is think about what you're pulling early, even before you start building your app. But then once something's already been built and your workloads are out there today, what can you do to improve the situation? Actually, in our survey, the next one of the other responses that didn't quite make the cut for its own theme was that 31% of people were concerned about runtime security. But when we asked what vulnerabilities people actually experienced, 23% said that containers were shipped with known vulnerabilities. So if you look at runtime security, it's really important, because I'm sure a lot of you were involved with or heard about Log4j last year. It was something that was sitting around for a long time, and then we found out about it and everyone scrambled to find where it was, and that's where you really want to be able to look at runtime to prioritize which projects are actually running this in production right now. We fix those first, and then we work our way backwards. And we can correlate issues with that behavior to make sure we prioritize fixing things that are actually executed and so on. But dev time is also really important, because it allows us to fix issues early before they're even running. It avoids wasted developer time having to go back and fix things later. And it also minimizes the chances of something making it into production and sitting around as a threat, especially to the point of 23% people knew, and that's people who knew they had. There's probably a lot more who didn't realize that they had shipped containers with known vulnerabilities, and so those were sitting out there, but they could have been addressed if there was more insight of what container image am I pulling, and at dev time, what am I pushing through pipeline and so on. So the next one down the list was consistent configuration. So applying consistent policy means, making sure you're declaring everything as code, so using your Helm charts or your YAML files, doing version control on those files, and then of course, just like with the container images, making sure you're not introducing IAC misconfigurations, which is actually the top cloud native threat in OWASP top 10 for cloud native security. So making sure you're not introducing misconfigurations into your infrastructure as code that you're then replicating through the environment. So replicate good, and then once it's out there, do drift detection. So moving on, funnily enough, the next biggest threat that people were concerned about was in fact misconfiguration. So how do you deal with that? So define the policy, detect unmanaged things, so what's already been deployed that's not managed by infrastructure as code. As I mentioned, find and fix issues at dev time. Make sure you deploy with that code that you've now assured is known good. Once it's out there, detect drift. And then also you might want to run something like a CSPM to understand the context, the greater cloud ecosystem. So like, what's your cloud networking looking like, and what other services is it connecting to? And you can get these insights about where your highest risks are, and that's where you go back to code, back to defining new policies based on how things are actually running in the cloud, and so on through the loop. So now I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'll leave, the survey will open in a second. You've got the instructions to join up there, you've got a few seconds to use the QR code. Otherwise, you'll have to use the URL at the top of the slide. And while you're finding that URL, I'll just go through a bit of a conclusion. So in conclusion, New Zealand is going strong with Kubernetes, but we're a little bit behind the global trend for adoption, but we also do have, higher challenges with finding the right people. But when we do run Kubernetes, we're getting a higher score in the benefits we're getting out of it. So I think we're probably making good choices about where we deploy it. Yeah. So I think building those skills in Kubernetes, in security, and we probably ran out of time for the survey, but we want to know what questions you have that you would want answered in the data when we publish the report, and whether or not you would participate in this if we asked for your email address next time. So you can find me at the Sneak booth. Come and let me know. We can even run a survey. I think I can leave that one open, or I can swap between them after the talk. I'll open it at lunch or something. Okay, I'll go. Done.
Cool.
That's it. Thank you.
Round of applause. Thank you very much.